want to fill a gap between some preoccupations of this week, that is mainly formalization, modeling, and logic on the one hand, and what psychologists talked about last week, that is experimental psychology of reasoning. So traditionally, logic is used as a formal normative system that shows us how we should reason in order to be rational. Our perspective is different. It's to rely on results in the experimental psychology of reasoning that we talked about last week, and to use logic as a relevant methodological toolbox for the modeling of these results, and to try this way to contribute to cognitive science. This talk will mainly provide a new explanation of famous experiments in the psychology of reasoning through the logical study of abduction. Okay, so there will be 4 parts in my talk today. Something about causal cognition, conditionals and causal cognition, conditionals and normative context, the dynamics of correction of abductions, and some ideas about dual processes. Okay, the experimental psychology of reasoning has given very different results in different contexts. Since 1966, we have many versions of the weights and cards selection task, in which it showed a strong tendency not to respect the laws of logic, and people committing systematically affirmation of the consequent and denial of the antecedent fallacies. On the other hand, since 1982, there are card selection tasks in normative context, and in this kind of situation, there is a strong tendency to respect the laws of logic, using modus ponens ponens and modus tollens tollens, logically valid inferences. Why is it so? My theory will try to explain this through the notion of abduction. So I won't go back to that slide because I presented it this morning with a Spurs distinguishing abduction, induction, and deduction. And our standpoint will focus on abductive reasoning and on important works on abduction done by the colleagues that I invited, Paul Taggart with his colleague Cameron Shelley, Atocha, and Lorenzo. Okay. I go back to an old technique in logic, that is truth tables. The logical conditional that if A then B is always true except in row 2 when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Then in this case, the conditional would be false. And I introduce a new conditional in order to model what happens in abduction. The abductive conditional I'm talking about is the one that is true not only in row 2, but also in row 3. That is, when the antecedent is false and the consequent is true, then the abductive conditional is false. And I use this symbol here to distinguish this from the equivalence. This abductive conditional is logically equivalent to the logical conditional, biconditional, according to their truth table. Because the truth table that I had on the right-hand side is the truth table of a biconditional. But Atocha talked about that this morning. In that abductive conditional, it involves a temporal succession that is not present in the logical biconditional. A is anterior to B, and B is posterior or consequent to A. And this abductive conditional, my thesis is that it is spontaneously at work in cognitive context when we look for causality in the perception of successive events. We think of event A as the cause and of event B as its effect. Such causal conditionals provide explanation of past or present events and provide predictions of future events. So let's go back to the experiment, the famous experiment with the psychologists. In causal cognitive context, in which we seek causal explanations and causal predictions, we apply spontaneously the abductive conditional and not the logical conditional. And this explains the usual weights and card selection behavior. Just as a reminder to make sure that everybody follows what's happening. In a classical occurrence of the experiment, 4 cards displayed on the table show respectively A, a D, a 4, and a 7. And the rule presented to the participants is if a card shows an A on one side, then its opposite side shows a 4. The question raised is what card should be turned over to make sure that the rule is respected? And the answer is a procedure of prediction and a procedure of explanation. So an abductive procedure. People turn over the Hay card to make sure that there will be a 4 card on the other side. That is, that row 1 of the table should occur and not row 2. A Hay is the cause of a 4, given the rule. And a procedure of explanation to turn over the 4 card to make sure that there is an A on the other side. That row 1 of the table should occur and not row 3, presuming by abduction that a 4 is caused by an A, and row 4 is considered as cognitively, as not cognitively relevant, as not triggered by the question. So logicians say, well, people do terrible mistakes, terrible fallacies. What I'm trying to explain is that no, they just do abduction. Okay, so this way I can model abduction with 4 types of abduction. 2 for the explanation of the past, 2 for the prediction of the future. 1 affirmative and 1 negative in each category. So this way we have an affirmative abduction for the explanation of the past. I presume that A is the cause of B. B occurs, so it's probably or surely caused by A. The negative form, if A then B, B does not occur, so it is because A did not occur. And in the prediction of the future, if A then B, A occurs, then B will occur. And in the prediction, a negative prediction of the future, if A then B, and A does not occur, so B will not occur. So psychologists who know at least some logic, they say, well, in this case, they use a modus tollens, and in this case, they use a modus ponens. My standpoint is that no, they do affirmation, negation of the consequent abduction. That is, in the same case, in the future, they don't do a modus ponens. They do an abductive prediction of the future. Okay. Now, why do people use abductive conditionals and causal reasoning? Well, we try to confirm our causal beliefs about the state of the world. It's as simple as that. And it is related to the thesis of active inference in Carl Friston. We tend not to do inferences to please a professor of logic. We do inferences as active inferences to try to minimize predictive errors, to minimize the free energy, to fight against entropy, to discover information in the world, and abduction is a kind of active inference. And because we rely on our long-term memory for establishing causality and take decision, this is why we use abduction. Our cognitive beliefs are determined by the experiences that are stored in our long-term memory. What we believe causally is determined by the successions of events that we have registered in our long-term memory. So we tend to consider the cause we believe in as necessary and sufficient conditions for the effect. And classical examples of causal abductions, we have talked a lot about that today. Medical diagnosis, police investigation are typical cases of abductions. From the result, the symptoms, we try to reach the cause. Okay. Abduction and the psychology of reasoning. Our thesis is not opposed to the 2 dominant psychological theories on reasoning with conditionals. The 2 dominant theories is the mental models theory, developed by Ruth Byrne, who was here last week, and Philip Johnson Laird. And the other one is the probabilistic theory, developed by Hoxford and Chater and David Over, who was here last week. And my standpoint is closer to the one of Henry Markowitz, that is, at times people use mental models to make inferences with conditionals. At times they use a more probabilistic approach. But our standpoint is that I'm not opposed to those 2 theories because they're more algorithmic than computational. Our standpoint is that the procedures described by these 2 theories that are mainly algorithmic are different strategies used to realize cognitive abductions. Our concern when we make inferences with conditionals is usually when it is in causal context, well, to corroborate or correct are abductions. Okay, and it's a more computational theory. Okay, counterexamples and complex causal chains are cause-effect beliefs often encounter counterexamples. And given that we happen to have an openness to, not always, as we will see later, we happen to have an openness to learn about the world, we tend to develop complex causal chains. On the contrary, normative reasonings, that is, inferences using conditionals but in normative contexts, as we will see, are not abductive and much less open to learning and much more deductive. And this is very important, as you will see. Okay, let's now see the experiments made by Griggs and Cox and by Tooby and Cosmides. It is the experiments about normative cost-benefit card selection tests. There are participants that are told that they are barmen who do not want to lose their job. And it's the same kind of experiment as the weighted cards. You have 4 cards disposed on a table. Only one side of the card can be seen. And participants are informed that each card contains an ordered beverage on one side and the age of the person who orders it on the other side. And the 4 cards displayed on the table, it's exactly the same structure as the weighted cards, are as follows. One card shows drinking beer. So there is an age under. Drinking Coca-Cola, there is an age under. Being at least 21 years old and being less than 21 years old. And the rule that is presented to the participant is a conditional rule, as before in the Wilson experiments, but it's a conditional rule about a norm, more precisely about privilege-price relation. Okay, it says if one wants to order alcohol, and you're the barman, then she must be at least 21 years old. The question raised, which card or cards must be turned over to verify if the rule has been correctly applied? And the logically valid answer is to turn over the beer card to make sure that the person is at least 21 years old. That is a logically valid modus ponens, and to turn over the less than 21 years old to make sure that the person does not order alcohol, which is the logically valid modus tollens. So in the causal cognitive context, people tend to use the right-hand side truth table. And in the other context, that is, yes, and the normative price privilege context, people tend to use the usually valid truth table of the logical conditional. Okay, the conditional is normative and not causal in the case of the barman. And the usual answer is to respect perfectly the laws of logical conditional. So my thesis is that in normative context, we don't look to be abductive. And in causal context, we look to be abductive. Okay. The Cosmides and Tooby explanation in 1989. They talk about the cheater detection device, and it has been proven that our frontal lobe plays that role. It's activated when we do such experiments. So their thesis is that human beings are social animals. They need cost-benefit rules for their survival, and so they create standard contracts based on shared social rules within a social group. And that kind of rule has the following structure. If one wants a privilege, then she must pay a price. And the barman experiments always establish a conditional relation between a privilege and a price that must be paid. So according to Cosmides and Tooby, we have inherited from our hunter-gatherer ancestors a cheating detection device that is located in our frontal lobe that allows us to recognize cheater. And this way, human beings have been able to replace what we call the rule of nature by the rule of law. And cheaters are more specifically the ones who try to get the privilege without paying the price. That is the one who act following the second row of the truth table, which is the false row. Okay. The device, according to Tooby and Cosmides, protects us against the cheaters. And this way, it allows better cooperation, helps human beings for collective survival. This is responsible for the fact that at least at times human beings are not fighting each other. Okay. The device would make us use the MPP and the MTT to avoid cheaters. That is the false second row of the truth table. My thesis is that they are right, that participants look for the detection of cheaters. They are aware that row 2 of the truth table is false. They apply spontaneously deduction. But the difference in the truth tables of the abductive conditional and the logically valid deductive conditional is not in row 2, it is in row 3, which is true in deduction and false in abduction. So the device is not only a detector of cheaters, it is also a detector of altruists. Who are altruists? The ones in row 3 who pay the price and who do not take the privilege and who could, for example, give it to someone else. And they are detectable as respecting the rule as much as the cheaters. So this way, when we live in a social group, we have shared rules, and these shared rules, fortunately, we have a mechanism in our frontal lobe that helps us to detect fair players, cheaters, but also altruists. So versus Tasmadis and Tooby, the device is more than a cheater detector. I would call it a behavior appraisal device. It can detect fair players, the one who paid the price to get the privilege, which is the true situation of row 1. The ones who do not pay the price and accept not to get the privilege, the true row 4. The cheaters, the one who try to get the privilege and who are not ready to pay the price, which is the false row 2. And also the altruists, the ones who pay the price and give the privilege to someone else. That is the row through that is detectable as not only a fair player, but a better than a fair player. And this way, using the deduction, interpreting the conditional as a logical conditional, we can do these things. And on the other hand, when we're in a causal context, when the conditional is causal, well, we try to explain the past and predict the future by abductions. Okay. So the evolutionary importance of altruism. Given that there are often cheaters in social groups, altruists are necessary for compensating for cheaters. So the rule of law is not sufficient for the survival of human societies. A certain amount of altruist behaviors is necessary for the survival of a community, notably for the survival of the weakest, the children, handicapped person, elders, and so on. So, and this way, we could say that altruists are the ones who fight against the law of nature, against the cruelty of evolution in human societies. And a device for the detection of altruists is also necessary. It's not only necessary to have altruists, but it's necessary to have a mechanism in our brain for the detection of altruists, which is the behavior detection device that I am talking about. And it's necessary for our survival because detecting altruists, we recognize them as being so, and we encourage and glorify their behavior. And it's important for the survival of societies to be able to recognize that there are altruists and to love them. Okay, reasons and causes. The major premise in the conditional reasoning that can express a cognitive causal belief or a normative reason for judging an action are different. And so both use conditional connectives, but they do so using two different conditionals, generating very different procedures. The truth table on the right-hand side and the truth table on the left side. When the conditional expresses a cause, it refers to an event in the world that makes another event happen as its effect. When the conditional expresses a reason, it refers to a human belief that is used to justify or condemn decisions and actions. Okay, so varieties in the use of conditional. Abduction, reasoning, and cognitive causal inference in order to make explanation of past events and predict future events. In this case, the reasoner is dealing with the state of the world. In the other situation, the deductive reasoning and normative context, in order to make appraising judgments on human behaviors, the reasoner doesn't try to deal with the state of the world, or as Lorenzo says, to deal with it openly with the state of the world, No, he tries to impose his values to the world. In spontaneous reasoning, these two activities use different inferential procedures as shown in Weizenkart's experiments and in the Barman experiment. It's a very mysterious situation for many psychologists who don't know logic, who don't know abduction, that there's a huge difference in the behavior of participants in experiments in Weizenkart's experiments and the Barman experiment. Okay, I synthesize here the two kinds of reasoning I'm talking about. The type of context. Here in the cognitive situation, the context is one of discovery. But the situation, it is a context of justification. The type of relation, the conditional expresses a relation of cause between a cause and an effect. In the normative situation, it's a price to pay and a privilege to obtain. The major premise expresses a cause for events. The antecedent of major premise, I would say. And the antecedent of the major premise in the normative situation is a reason for action. The goal in the cognitive, causal cognitive situation, explain the past and predict the future. In the normative situation, make a judgment on human action. The type of reasoning, as I explained, abductive conditional, deductive conditional, with different truth tables. Logical value, it is in the abductive context, it's logically valid, it's not certain, it's probable, as Lorenzo explained this afternoon. With the normative, it is valid. So it has many consequences, for example, about counterexamples. In the abductive context, we tend to accept more the counterexample as being integrated, as it is relevant to consider them as being integrated in the reasoning. In the normative situation, the counterexample, instead of being accepted, they are condemned as cheating. The dynamics of the causal context, well, it's more changing. Each time we see counterexample, we have a tendency to change the rules to correct the abduction. It is more stable in the normative situation. We don't change our moral values often in a lifetime. Okay. The emotions involved, anticipation, and when the anticipation is not verified by a there is a counterexample, so we get surprised. On the other hand, the emotions involved in the normative situation, trust with people who are fair players, admiration for the altruists, and disgust for the cheaters. And the types of signs, I refer here to, I would say, a Peircean standpoint. Human beings invade their environment with signs. In the causal context, we develop nudges, like Richard Thaler explained. In the normative context, well, we expose our banners, the T-shirt of my favorite sport team, the flag of my country, and so on. Okay. The third part, the dynamics of correction of abduction, the learning dynamics of spontaneous causal reasoning. We perceive succession of events, and we tend to consider these successions as causal mechanisms. I refer here to David Hume, Critique of Induction, and Immanuel Kant, thesis about the category of causality in our mind. So the non-logically valid abductions by which we treat causal cognition are not certain and often meet counterexample. Abductions are reasoning procedures that are appropriate for finding causes, given that they are flexible and revisable reasoning procedures. When our abductions meet counterexamples, our causal beliefs can change, and we can learn new causal rules. There are two types of situations well described by the psychologists who don't know anything about abduction. Last week, nobody talked about abduction. Meeting alternative antecedents. This is what occurs when the effect occurs, but not the cause, or meeting what the psychologists call disabler. The conditional disabler is that the cause occurs, but not the effect. Okay, let's take them one after the other. And the causal inference, for example, in participants submitted to the following inference. If one throws a stone at the window, then the window breaks, and the window breaks. Then someone has thrown a stone at the window. That is the abduction we usually do spontaneously. But actually, it happens that nobody threw a stone at the window, and it broke nonetheless. So the participants, what will they conclude? They can conclude, not always, but often they conclude that something else is responsible for the breaking of the window, like an earthquake or a severe storm. The cause that was considered abductively as a necessary and sufficient condition for the breaking of the window is now considered as only a sufficient condition and not a necessary condition. And the reasoner can learn this way alternative causes. And Baruya and Markovitz have studied that phenomenon deeply in their article of 2002, and Henry talked about that last week. He teaches in the Department of Psychology here at UQAM. Okay, so meeting alternative antecedents and causality. We move from A is the cause of B to A or C is the cause of B. Learning an alternative cause it happens in 2 of the 4 abductions we talked about. It happens in the affirmation abductive explanation of the past. That is the affirmation of the consequent. So a logician would say, well, people are stupid. No, they're not stupid. They're just trying to understand what happens in this world. So we had A is the cause of B, and B occurs though, so it has been caused by A, pardon, but at times B occurs and A did not occur. So we move to A or C is the cause of B, and B occurs, so A or C has happened. And learning an alternative cause in the negative abductive prediction of the future. That corresponds to the negation of the antecedent. We had A is the cause of B and not A, then not B. But at times, A does not occur, but B nonetheless occurs. So we move to A or C is the cause of B, and not A occurs. So C and B will occur or not B. So learning alternative causes makes the failure of the antecedent, the affirmation of the consequent in explanations, and of the failure of the negation of the antecedent in predictions. It comes from these 2 supposed fallacies. So the correction of these fallacies allows learning. So logicians would say we should not commit those fallacies. What I'm saying is that we systematically commit these fallacies, and the correction of these fallacies are important motivations for learning. The logical interpretation of causal conditionals helps to worry of abduction and to find alternative causes. In this case, logic is cognitively relevant. We could say, what's the use of logic? Well, the use of logic is relevant in that case because it helps to consider it as true, row 3 of the truth table. Is what I'm saying is that we use abduction. More dogmatic people use abduction considering that the truth table appropriate is the one on the left side, and more people that are wiser, I would say, or more reflective or more metacognitive, do abduction, but treat the conditional as a logical conditional. So this way, they're open to alternative antecedents and to alternative causes. In this case, we cognitively make abduction algorithmically, but treating formally, computationally, the conditional involved as a logical one. And so in this situation, logic helps us to adapt to our world and to learn. Now let's go to the second type of situation. The cause occurs, but not the effect. The experience has been performed first by Ruth Byrne in 1989, and Ruth was with us last week. If Mary has her homework to do, she will study late at the library. She has her homework to do, so participants tend to conclude that she will study late in the library. So the psychologists say they use systematically modus ponens opponents. Second case, if the library is open, then Mary will study late at the library. And the library is open, so participants tend to conclude that she will study late at the library. Third experiment, we come back to the first. Mary has homework to do, she will study late at the library, and she has homework to do. And participants avoid making the modus ponens opponents, not knowing if the library is open. The ignorance of the schedule of the library is considered as a disabler of the MPP. So note that our standpoint is that we are not dealing here with the with the MPP and the NTT. We are dealing with the affirmation of the antecedent and not with the real MPP. And we are dealing with the not with the real MPP, because people are not logicians. They don't know, most of us don't know about logic. So they make an abductive affirmation of the antecedent. Okay. So if we try to formalize this, reading disablers makes the cause not sufficient. For example, to throw a stone at a window is not sufficient. It must also be thrown hard. What is sufficient from now on is a conjunction of causes, just like the homework in the library being open at the same time. And negative, now the two other forms of abduction are responsible what happens here. Negative abductive explanation of the past, which is logically equivalent to MTT, but people are not doing MTT. They move from A is the cause of B and B does not occur. So A did not occur, but at times B does not occur and A with a dissembler as occurred. And same thing for the prediction of the future, which is logically equivalent to the MPP. A is the cause of B and A occurs, then B will occur. But at times A occurs and it does not because of a disabler. That is, A occurs and does with a disabler, and so B will not occur. The conditional happens to be disabled precisely because it is an uncertain abductive conditional, not a logical one. Meeting a disabler, a causal chain can be lengthened, which is another kind of causal learning. We move from a simpler conditional A is the cause of B to a lengthened conditional A and C is the cause of B. This is in accordance with Stenning and Van Lambalgen in 2008 in their famous book. According to them, when people make a prediction, they do not treat the prediction as A will realize B. It is A and nothing abnormal occurs, then B will occur. And when sometimes something abnormal occurs, that is a disabler, then B is not drowned as a conclusion. Abductions and causal chains. Through successive encounters of alternative causes and additional causes, we learn progressively causal chains. A or B is the cause of C, and C will realize D, and so on. That make us take appropriate decision in specific situation. An important part of what we know is made of these causal chains. Given that these causal chains are numerous in our memory and that it might be hard to find which one to activate in a given situation, the nudges of Thaler and Susty are often useful to trigger these chains. Disjunctions are useful logical tools for the modeling of alternative causes, just like conjunctions are useful logical tools for the modeling of additional causes. And we can say that induction is necessary to start a causal conditional, to establish a causal conditional. But afterwards, abductions and the correction of these abductions can explain the building of these chains. Okay, am I okay with the time? Yes? Okay, so abduction, deduction, and structural properties. Given that alternative causes are discovered in the failure of abduction, the usual cause is not a necessary condition. The treatment of abductive causal conditional as behaving as logical conditionals avoid the affirmation of the consequent, the negation of the antecedent fallacies, and it helps to discover alternative causes and to open our mind to diversity. So this way, learning classical logic is a good tool to open us to alternative causes. Okay, on the other end, given that additional causes are discovered in avoiding the abductions that are equivalent to the MPP and the MTT, the usual cause is not anymore a sufficient condition for the effect. The treatment of abductive causal conditionals as working like a classical logic conditional is not sufficient. It is an obstacle to discover additional causes. It keeps our beliefs too rigid, and it's close to what you explained about the difference between abduction and logical deduction. In abductive procedures, there is an openness to the world and to counterexamples. And in classical logic, the deduction with conditionals is rigid. I mean, you cannot learn new rules using classical propositional logic. Learning additional causes requires an openness to creative thinking, what you explain better than I can do, to creative thinking beyond the limits of classical propositional logic. On the other hand, deductive conditionals are non-ampliative and monotonic. They organize their information so that they are not subject to revision. See what happens in the normative context that I explained. Abductive conditionals, on the other hand, are ampliative instead of non-ampliative and non-monotonic instead of monotonic. They create information. They create new information in our conclusions and are this way uncertain and subject to revision. This is what happens in causal context. What happens with new question? What happens with counterfactual conditionals? Having read the beautiful book by Ruth Byrne, Rationality and Imagination, and having heard what she said last week, I can say that I'm talking about inferences with a major premise that is a conditional. The conditional is causal in some contexts, normative in other contexts, and there are at least a third kind of context, which is counterfactual conditionals, the one that are used in poetry or in literature, for example, or in dreams and things like that. So I think that I had to work on that for maybe another summer school. Okay, normative deductions and counterexample. The cause-benefit normative inferences are deductive. Facing a counterexample, we do not tend to revise our beliefs contrary to what we do in causal inferences. We tend, on the contrary, to condemn the counterexamples as cheating, as not respecting a rule that we judge important to respect. Our norms, and this is probably the origin of fights, violence, and wars in human societies. Okay, our norms tend to keep rigid. We change them rarely. They apply deductively the logically valid MPP and the MTT rules. Okay, last part about 10 minutes, excellent. I'm on the fourth and last part. Links between what I'm saying about conditional inferences and dual processes. A brief recall on a system 1 and system 2. So the thesis of Jonathan Evans, Tversky, Daniel Kahneman about dual processes, which is now, I would say, considered as something established in the psychology of reasoning. We have two families of reasoning procedures that come from different parts of our brain. S1, which is implicit, automatic, low effort, rapid, and works by default. And S2, that is explicit, controlled, that requires high effort, that is slow and inhibitory. Okay, my thesis on S1 in causal reasoning. There are, I would say, two systems in S1, a flexible S1 and a more dogmatic S1. The flexible S1 is such that the abductive, non-logical connective is used to discover causes in the world as necessary and sufficient conditions, closing the world. But the encounter of counterexamples, as in the examples I gave earlier in this talk, and the encounter of counterexamples happened to constrain the reasoner to open the world and to accept alternative causes and additional causes. It's often painful, but in a flexible S1, we have a tendency, well, if I threw the stone and the window didn't break, then I can imagine that there was something missing. Okay, or I didn't throw the stone and the window broke, probably there's another cause that made it broken. Okay, there are also a dogmatic S1 family of procedures that actively oppose counterexamples and the opening of the world that it involves. Reasoning biases, for example, bias of confirmation, the bias of the belief bias. I would say these biases have a cognitive function, that is, they are strategies to realize a closure when we're not able to open the world. And what about conspiracy theories? They do the same, reducing numerous events as effects of a simple, single, always the same invading cause, that is the presumed conspiracy. In S2, we have a tendency, on the contrary, to open systematically the world. Finding causality in the world is valued as a dynamics of formulation of hypotheses and of correction of these hypotheses to improve progressively our knowledge. And we could say that in S2 reasoning, we enjoy learning about the world. Okay. Now, Stanovich and Toplak, and I will finish with that. Stanovich and Toplak in 2022 have made a very, what I consider a very important contribution. They characterized S2 reflective processes as actively open-minded thinking. According to our previous slide, we could say that we can distinguish, according to this concept of actively open-minded thinking, the dogmatic S1, the flexible S1, and the S2. The dogmatic S1 is actively close-minded thinking. It requires an active fight against new evidence to keep the world closed. Look at what the MAGA disciples do in the US. It looks like that, like that. The flexible S1 is not active, it's passive. It's passively open, not closed, but open-minded thinking. It accepts with a certain resistance, with negative emotions, new evidence as requiring a complexification of the causal chain. And in S2, people are actively open-minded. That is, S2 looks for new evidence that could make causal chains more complex. It is eager to learn, the S2 system. And in accordance with Dene's 2.0 dual process theory, there is a 1.0 theory that comes from Kahneman and people like Jonathan Evans and Keith Stanovich in this first version. Dene develops a 2.0 version of the process of the dual process theory. And in the version 2.0, S1 is smarter than in version 1.0. The distance between S2 and S1 gets narrower. And I think that what I'm saying here is in accordance with that, because people fight their intuition in S1, in the dogmatic S1, and they concede to their intuition in the flexible S1. And also, I would say that in this direction, the studies that Valerie Thompson, that was here last week too, about the feeling of rightness in our inferences is something important to contribute to the debate about the version 1 and version 2 of the dual processes. Okay, ampliativity, monotonicity, and non-monotonicity. Causal reasoning is abductive. Being so, it is ampliative, not logically valid, but nonetheless necessary to produce causal beliefs about the world and to take rather easy decisions. Classical logic is non-ampliative and so avoids treating causes as necessary conditions. Good for him. But it helps this way to open the world to alternative causes, but it is monotonic and so cannot help to learn additional causal roots. And probabilistic logic and probability coherence theory that Paul talked about, the probability that coherence is something important here, as it is probabilistic logic. It's non-ampliative, but non-monotonic, and so it can help to open the world to additional causes. The conditional probability can represent a probabilistic truth value of different alternative causes, and that's with probability, and the Bayes law can correspond to the modification of probability. Okay, a new definition of reasoning procedure in our logical cognitive perspective. And it's nothing genial, it's just the conjunction, interdisciplinary intersection of logic and cognition. In our logical cognitive perspective, reasoning procedures should have a cognitive definition and a formal definition. Abduction, its formal definition, the first premise is a causal conditional rule, and the second premise is the affirmation or the negation of one of its components, and the conclusion is the affirmation or the negation of the other component. So we have affirmation of the antecedent and denial of the antecedent for the prediction, affirmation of the consequence, and denial of the consequent for explanation. And a causal definition would be a procedure of discovery for establishing a cognitive causal explanation or prediction. And deduction, the formal definition is that the premises are rules that are assumed to be true, and the conclusion is necessarily true, following a logically valid, truth-preserving logical rule, like the MPP or the MPT with the conditionals. And the cognitive definition is a procedure for deduction, a procedure of justification for drawing a conclusion that would be necessarily true given premises containing a rule that is presumed to be true. And this fits very well with normative reasoning. Our presentation implies that new experiments are required in psychology of reasoning. Some conclusions rapidly. Well, our standpoint is one of a naturalist conception of reasoning. Reasoning with conditionals in causal cognitive context and in normative price and privilege context are very different. When you're in causal cognitive context, you treat conditionals as abductions. Abductive causal reasoning is usually open to learning causal chains through the discovery of alternative causes or additional causes. These are the two causal strategies that can contribute to our learning. The learning of alternative causes occur in the discovery of counterexample in the use of abductive conditional fallacies. And the learning of additional causes occurs in the discovery of counterexample to the use of the abductive equivalent of the MPP, that is affirmation of the antecedent, and the MTT, that is denial of the consequent. Reasoning in normative price and privilege context is deductive and much less open to revision. And in S2 reflective reasoning, learning is made easier. Treating causal abduction as logical conditionals helps to learn alternative causes. Classical logic is good for learning additional causes, but treating causal abduction as conditional probability or as strategies for establishing coherence, as Paul has shown this morning. This is what helps to learn additional causes, and classical logic is not helpful at all here. It's too rigid. And our moral conclusion, I open a door, which is one of my deep beliefs. Open-mindedness, that is in S2, that is what Stanovich and Toplak call actively open-minded thinking, are important conditions for a peaceful survival of human beings. And that's it. And I have classical references and some of my three colleagues here. Thank you.
Question, time for questions.
Okay. My student Marianne is the boss in this school. She's not used to it, but that's the way it works.
Yeah, 15 minutes for questions. I can start it. Take this one. I was wondering if we had enough time, if we could get a preview of the way you will modelize the trivalence between the cheater, the fair player, and the altruist in a sphere of opposition. Or if you want to keep that a secret until.
Well, I'm supposed to talk about it in my next lecture in the upcoming conference. I can give at least an insight. The abductive, no, let's start with the normative price and privilege inference. Given that the normative price and privilege inference spontaneously puts at work the logical conditional of classical propositional logic, it treats the square of opposition the way it is in the classical logic. I mean, if A then B is the rule respected by the fair players using the MPP, or the one who do not want the privilege using the MTT, and A and not B is the opposite corner of the square, which is the square of the node of the cheaters, opposed to the rule, the one who do not respect the rule, and the altruist who does not take the privilege and who pays the price and gives the price to a third person is the subaltern of the if-then rule. I mean, when you're an altruist, it implies that you're automatically a fair player. And when you're not a fair player, you cannot be an altruist. So there are subalterns. And the other part of the question, what happens when you make abduction? you cross the square of opposition. You have, if A then B, no, you have A and not B, not A and B, and if A then B and if B and A become equivalent. So you have a triangle instead of a square. You cross the triangle, you have A happens and not B. This is the situation of the disabler. Not A and B, alternative cause. And the equivalence between the two, which is applying simply the abductive condition.
And in the square before the abduction, what happens to the last node? Is it not playing at all? Not doing anything?
Yeah.
Have you named it?
Yeah, when you change a square to a triangle, the relation between the different nodes is not contrary, subcontrary, subaltern, and contradictory. It is in three situations that are incompatible one to the other. There is three contraries. That is to have a corroboration of the if then rule and abduction can be true, but when it is true, the alternative cause is false, and additional cause is false. And when the additional cause is true, then the two others are true, are false. So you have one true and two false, and so they are incompatible. And when they are incompatible, there is a hate possibility in the truth table that is none of these three situations happen. So you can imagine it corresponds to the way human beings behave. I mean, I think that throwing a stone to the window is the cause of breaking the window. Others say, well, it happens that it breaks without throwing the stone. Okay. And it can happen that you throw the stone and it doesn't break because you don't throw it enough hard. And there are other situations in which people say, well, I don't really know what is the relationship between throwing a stone at the window and it will break or not. I don't know, which is the eighth possibility that is open with incompatibility between the three nodes, between the three vertices of the triangle. So it's introductory to that future lecture.
And how about a name for that person? A non-player?
We could say a non-player, that is someone who doesn't feel concerned by the situation. He's neutral about the normative situation, or he doesn't know about the cause of the events. He's the outsider. And for example, I have someone, what is responsible for the breaking of the window? Some say it's when you throw a stone on it. Others say, when you throw a stone, or when something else like a storm. And others say, well, you can throw a stone, but it's not sufficient. You need to throw it hard. And other people say, well, I really don't know. I come from a country, for example, where there are no windows, and you say, I don't know what this is, and I don't know if it can break or not.
Then the outside really good.
Yeah.
Good name.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You were the manager, but
2 minutes then, so.
2 minutes, I'm talkative.
Question, trying to link with the second talk of the day, so further.
Oh, there are many relations that you could establish with Paul, Lorenzo, and the that shot set.
With the first stage, for example, we are here in a state of belief or in a state of doubt.
Yeah.
And we try to resolve tension.
Yeah.
Resolving the tension costs energy, so maybe the outsider could be in a stance of like,
He could.
I don't have time for this, I have money to make, see you.
Of course,
go on like.
and you touched something related to Carl Friston's theory of active inference.
Whether you have a stake or not.
Exactly. Well, Serge, what you're talking about, these windows, I don't care. I have something else to do in my life.
So the question would be, now we have specialized institutions, so the department, science, so people are paid to give energy and time to complex.
Exactly. I am paid to do the job I'm doing.
So in the daily life, people want to go around about with their life and don't care this much about
Exactly.
thinking about it, so they.
You do not have belief, and you do not change your beliefs if you don't have any interest. You feel concerned. Abduction?
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a general question about use of reasonable types in these examples. My question is, what extent have you seen that it's not only abduction, but a combination of abduction and deduction? In your slides, it's only abduction. But when you explain, the thing is, according to Peirce, but I think this is common sense, you draw a hypothesis and then you want to see what can be deduced from it, and that is deduction. So, do you know,
I agree with you.
or what do you think?
Okay, I agree with you that the human mind, as you know, uses much inferential procedures. At times, it uses some types and at other times, other types. And often it mixes these kinds of inferences. I agree with you. And my presentation insisted on the difference of the context of discovering causality in the world and the context of judging of the human behavior. So this is why they look more separated than they are in reality. But you're totally right. The human mind is complex. There is a mix of these procedures in every human behavior. But I would say the dominance is abductive in the search for causality, and the dominant is deductive in the establishment of a moral judgment. Thanks to you. Thanks for this good question.